Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the KBEAR OS1PRO. So if you remember a couple weeks ago I talked about this, the KBEAR OS1PRO is the first product out of a collaboration between Whizzer, maker of Opera Factory brand. If we flip this around, I think it actually says Whizzer right there, and KBEAR. So I don't fully understand why they chose the OS1PRO or why they released it a week or two right before the KS1, but it is what it is, and here it is. So if you look on Amazon in the US today, it's about $26. There's still a 30% promotion on it. If you do the math on that, that's what, $18 or $19. So quite a bargain for what it's known for, a base headset. So $18, 2-day shipping, return policy, all those things work in favor of putting it on Amazon. So for those of you who haven't had a close-up look at this guy, it still has Opera Factory branding on it. This one says Opera Factory, this one says Junior. This is a KZ star tip, typical KZ tip. This is the stock tip that it comes with, and they're actually reasonably close. I actually just prefer the, let's see if we get the right angle. So the KZ extends a little bit further up into your ear. This one is a little bit more shallow, but the nozzle itself is actually pretty close. The cable is a KBEAR Limpid Pro. I wouldn't worry too much about that. I just used it because I like it, but in this case, it's not going to make that much of a difference. So thank you to KBEAR for sending this one out to me, and I look forward on Amazon. So for those of you who have run across, Opera Factory in the past, if you do a Google search for Opera Factory, it's sort of associated with Basshead and metal for some reason. Two groups who gravitated towards the brand. And I think it's just an affordable example of a set that worked well for those two genres. So, out of the box, it sounds Basshead dark, and that's great if you're a Basshead. For metal, it doesn't actually sound all that great. So that one was kind of surprising out of the box. Maybe it's just the OS1PRO versus the OM1 versus the other Opera Factory sets. But as far as the OS1PRO, it's got this really rolled off treble, so it comes off as quite dark. Not exactly what you're in the mood for with metal and some higher end guitars. So if you remember a couple weeks ago, I talked about using Wavelet on Android. It's this really great parametric EQ. And on this one, I would say it's absolutely required that you bump up the treble. Inside a Wavelet on the EQ, there's actually a preset called Treble Boost. I highly suggest that one because it's super simple. Otherwise, you got to boost, 5K plus. You can make a big shelf there and increase everything because it's rolled off quite a bit. And if you don't do that, everything is really muffled. It sounds like you're listening to, a speaker on the other side of a wall. So, highly suggest it. I would say it's mandatory that you have to EQ this one if you want it to sound anything other than Basshead dark. So the first time you put this one in your ear, you may hear some clicking. It's got a bit of driver flex. Every time I put it in, it clicks a little bit. So don't be shocked about that. And volume is another one. This one needs quite a bit of volume to bring the vocals forward. Otherwise, they fall backwards. So bump up the volume. Even though it sounds about right to what your normal listening is, just click it up a couple times just to make sure that the vocals are forward. I just noticed that the vocals came in at a pretty good volume, but they were set back a little bit. And as you click the volume, they sort of move forward without increasing in volume as much as you think they were. And you get to this point where it sounds comfortable, but the vocals are forward. So do play with the volume on this one as well. So what does it sound like with EQ? And I'm only going to talk about it with EQ because I wouldn't use this without EQ. It's very much a balanced V-shape. And again, once you increase that upper range, sounds great on guitars. The vocals open up a lot. And there's not as much bass bleed as you're expecting in a bass headset. There's actually a quite nice separation between the two. And I think that's one of the major differences between this and the KS1 is that there's just more separation. The KS1 is this nice, smooth, cohesive, range, whereas this one, the bass is offset a little bit. There's a little barrier between that and the mid, so lower male vocals didn't quite get sucked into the bass as much as they do on the KS1s, but you know, don't be mistaken, they're both heavy bass sets, and this one is in that big V shape as well. So a little bit of separation, but still a huge bass set. But when you EQ it, you end up with this detailed, nice vocals. There's nice decay on the mids, which is actually really nice. It's warmish, but with an edge. So I think the KS1 is quite a bit warmer than this guy. This guy is not cold, but it's got a really nice edge to it. So it's, you know, barely warmish, but a really nice edge. And for those of you who have the BL03 versus the BL01, you'll sort of understand that there's the 03 was this really smooth set, relaxed, laid back, and the 01, it just kind of stepped up the aggression a little bit. So it's a little more aggressive, a little edgier. The vocals can get, especially the upper range vocals, can, you know, border on too aggressive. So that's where this one lies versus the KS1. It's just kind of splitting hairs between the two, but they're both big V sets. So the bass, again, it's sort of like the KS1. It's very extended and it's got this big weighty punch. So if you take a look at Makaba by Jane, that 8-second, you know, this thing booms just as hard as anything you have. Very impactful, weighty, and something like Hong Kong Express, there's a song called This. It's got plenty of rumble, not super rumble, not rip your face rumble like the guy who suggested that song, but quite a bit of rumble. So this one, you know, just like the KS1, it tries to balance this quality versus quantity, and both of them sort of lean more towards quantity than quality, but they both, you know, stay in the range of controlled. The bass isn't all loose and distorted. They do a really good job of providing a really high level of bass, but not going too far off the quality. So this one is very much in line with where the KS1 was as well. So the mids, like I said, still bassy. You're still going to get heavier versions of your songs like REM Drive, but that lower mid has a little more separation. And I point out that song because that was a song that I pointed out in the KS1 where Michael Stipe's voice just kind of fell right into the bass. And there's just a little more separation on this one, but not as smooth. It's more edgier, and if you turn the volume up, those female vocals are going to borderline be aggressive. You know, depending on how sensitive you are, maybe they're going to get a little shouty, but again, play with your tips. That's going to help a little bit. That 5K EQ treble boost, again, that's going to affect that as well. The more you boost that, you know, the more there's a tendency to lift that part as well. So be careful with that. So do pay attention. But like Johnny Cash's God's Gonna Cut You Down, that version, lower male vocal, it just sounds really, really good. It's just really detailed, intimately close for a male vocal. And those are, especially with V-shaped sets, those are a little harder to do because a lot of times that male vocal just falls back into this muddy, bassy section. And again, just having a little bit of separation, his voice comes across really clear. It's quite nice. And then on the upper end, Georgia Smith's Blue Lights, that Machiavelli sessions that I mentioned on some other set, you know, as soon as you EQ this one, her voice really opens up. There's a ton of detail and texture and really emotional. It's a really good vocal set. And I know people associate it with bass heads and metal, but when you EQ this one right, those vocals come across really, really nice. And I'm just kind of an edgy guy, so I don't, smooth vocals sound great, but give me a little more edge, where those vocals, like her vocal, cuts across your ears sort of like a knife. That's what I like as well. So her voice on this set, I think, sounds really, really nice for that reason. But if you listen closely, her voice is really in focus, and like I said, it's got a really nice edge to it. And then you listen to some of the lower range in the background, some of those lower horns, and they sound a little bit diffuse and not as focused as they should be. It's sort of like watching a very sharp image, like a portrait mode. The face is very much in focus, but the background is just a little bit fuzzy, and that's, you know, it's kind of a bassy bass head. That's sort of the effect that you get. So, but it just happened to pop out on that set because her voice is so much in focus. and you're trying to listen to some of the instruments in the back and you just can't quite focus on them. They sound okay, but not that detail and focus that you get on her voice. So the treble, like I said, out of the box, it's rolled off pretty hard, and you must EQ it to bring it back to the point where you can hear it, especially if you're a guitar guy. So something like Bleed It Out by Linkin Park, or even Papa Roach's Last Resort, there's tons of bass. Both of those songs have pretty strong drums and tons of low end on that song, but as soon as you EQ it and raise those levels, you're back to this very much balanced big V shape, and those guitars and those vocals stay sharp and detailed and rise above all that bass. And you know, it's very much what I said about the KS1. It's just a great sounding, full, balanced V shape. And with EQ, this one kind of hits that mark as well. So detail, you know, I think it's probably not as good as the KS1, and part of that is just the EQ, because you end up EQing it quite a bit, and I think that has some effects on the very fine details in the treble. You know, detailed, but probably not as good as a natural sounding, you know, without EQ, so I'll sort of half blame myself for some of that problem. But staging, there's actually quite a bit of width here, and considering the set is, what, a couple of years old or something like that, it doesn't sound old. It actually sounds like a modern set because there's plenty of width. And when you go back to Georgia Smith's Blue Lights, this Machiavelli version, it starts off with there's like an orchestra, and it sounds the way it should. It's the orchestra is in the back row almost, and almost back to the stage, and as soon as she walks up to the mic and starts singing, she's very much in focus in front of that orchestra, and the whole thing kind of sounds as it should, as you imagine the room being laid out when they recorded it. So I think kind of on that mark, I think it does really well. I think there's just a really nice sense of space and staging. And as I said, those lower range instruments are going to get kind of lost in the imaging. The higher end things that have been boosted, you know, much sharper, much more identifiable. And her voice is, you know, unmistakable, centered, very fine. Not as much height as it really should, but that's probably the only bit that I would say not as modern as it should be. Like the KS1 has some height, and a lot of these newer, even budget sets have some nice height, and this one is very much a width and depth. So, but still a great sounding set. So that's my take. It is, again, it's kind of odd that KBEAR released, you know, two bassy, strong V-shaped sets almost back to back, but they did. And on this one, not quite the KS1, you know, out of the box, you can plug it in and go, and it sounds great. This one, again, please EQ it. Don't listen to this muffled midsection. Boost at least 5K, treble boost, whatever your phone supports, and bring it back to where it should be. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.